If you want to spread an idea in the modern day, it is not enough to write a book or start a podcast or even make a YouTube video. You must make your idea memeable. And at its best, I do think there is a real art into boiling down observations about complex ideas into an image or a short bit of text that people can instantly understand and may even find quite funny. So today, I thought we would take another jaunt down to r/philosophy memes to see what the most contagious ideas of 2024 were. Both to have a bit of a laugh, but also to be exposed to some philosophy that we may not have encountered before. Also, as always with these videos, I just need more time to work on my next script. So, without further ado, let's crack on. Right, so first we have a meme from SeveralGap7472, and it's entitled, "Can the Non-Normative Fields Get a Little Love?" And it's the philosophy memes page upholding ethics and political philosophy while leaving metaphysics and epistemology to drown a little, and the philosophy of maths and physics is far under the water and appears to have rotted away. Yeah, I think this makes a reasonably accurate observation about the way that philosophy is handled online. I would also add to the ethics and political philosophy probably existentialism. I mean, if you look at my channel, I do occasionally talk about a hardcore analytic topic. Like at the beginning of last year, I did one on A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth and Logic, which is a really seminal work of hardcore early 20th century analytic philosophy. And it's also one of my favorite philosophy books. It's one of the books that got me into philosophy. But if you look at the topics that tend to do well, they do tend to be about existentialism and emotion. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I love learning about that type of philosophy. And I love writing about it, and I also love talking about it. Subjects like ethics and philosophy of religion are also fascinating. And I think that one of the reasons why these fields are so popular is just because they're applicable to pretty much everyone. I mean, everyone feels things. Most people will fall in love at some point, and pretty much everyone will have to engage with the concept of religion at some point in their lives, even if they're not personally religious, right? Like, I'm not personally religious, but I know religious people. I even sing in churches sometimes because I used to be a choral singer. And I do engage with the ideas of religion on a semi-regular basis, and not just with the channel. I have religious friends who I talk to regularly. One of my friends is even a priest, and so obviously our conversations tend to focus on religion. But in some ways, I do think the lack of attention we pay to something like epistemology, and especially something like the philosophy of maths or mathematical logic, is a real shame. I mean, epistemology deals with how we know things and what can be known and different types of knowledge. And that seems just as applicable as studies on emotion or studies on God. We all have to deal with the concept of knowledge in our lives. There's just no getting around it. We have to act, and we have to assume that certain things are true in order to act. And knowing what to consider true is a very, very useful skill, and epistemology is a huge part of that. Likewise, although mathematical logic can seem dry, it is intensely useful. It's by far the most useful thing I learnt at university because it allows you to break down arguments into their constitutive parts and then outline them, criticize them, and explore them. You get very used to spotting the weak points in arguments and also where arguments can be improved. It also just helps you check your own thinking. It is so in that Socratic ideal of knowing yourself. So, while I do have a lot of existentialist videos planned for the coming year, I am also going to try to focus on some more epistemological topics and maybe even delve into mathematical logic if people are interested. I've been drafting and redrafting a video on Gödel's incompleteness proofs because they're so interesting, and I do think they are genuinely beautiful. But at the same time, it's quite difficult to make it compelling. I think that a lot of maths channels do very well with creating graphics, but I am not good at that. I'm a pretty terrible coder, so I think I would really struggle. But I might throw something up, maybe on Patreon, or maybe do a live stream of just me going through logic questions and explaining the foundations of just basic symbolic logic, and then maybe we could build up from there. I don't know, I'm not decided yet. But do let me know what topics you want me to cover outside of existentialism and philosophy of religion and classic literature, because I'm always interested in expanding the channel into new areas, and I do think it'll be really good fun. Funnily enough, the sorts of topics that I mainly worked on during my undergrad and my master's were quite different from the ones that I tend to focus on the channel at the moment. I mainly did do symbolic logic and formal epistemology and philosophy of science. Those were kind of my big three. I also did a lot of philosophy of language. So perhaps I'd like to make some more videos on that in the future, but also it's really fun doing existentialist videos. I've learned a lot more about the field, especially from a more academic perspective. I've really enjoyed reading a lot of the academic secondary literature on people like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Camus, because it's not something that I got to explore as much in my very hardcore analytic philosophy university course. One of my other goals for the coming year is to cover some of the more obscure existential philosophers, if that makes sense. People like Lev Shestov or Max Stirner, although I don't know if he'd like me calling him an existentialist. But I'd really like to explore some of that. Or even some of the more famous existential philosophers that just don't get a lot of airtime on popular media like YouTube. So like Jaspers. So Jaspers is huge in the field of existential philosophy, but I don't see many YouTube videos or kind of posts online covering him. But his thought is hugely influential to almost everyone that came after him. But yes, I do broadly agree with this meme that ethics and political philosophy and existentialism get a lot more airtime online than something like metaphysics, epistemology, or especially formal philosophy. If you are interested in looking at more formal philosophy, there is a center for mathematical philosophy in Munich. And I'll link their website in the description. And they always do some fantastic research. I kind of gently follow a lot of their professors to try and just see what's going on in that field, because it's not very sexy, but it's so brilliantly interesting. So yeah, I highly encourage you to check it out. Okay, next we have a meme by Use Abject, and it's the Donald Trump and Joe Biden meme, and Donald Trump's been given Schopenhauer's hair. And it reads Schopenhauer defending his PhD thesis and then Hegel in the examination committee. So this meme is in reference to an anecdote from the history of philosophy, or I suppose a fun fact, I guess, which is that Hegel was on Schopenhauer's PhD committee. He was part of the group of people that awarded Schopenhauer his PhD. And from what little I know about it, he really was quite defensive of Schopenhauer in that setting. I think that he voted in favor of him receiving his PhD. And during that defense, Hegel did pose a question to Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer answered him. And Hegel seemed to be broadly satisfied with that answer, at least, again, from my limited knowledge about the event. So it did seem that Hegel was broadly pro-Schopenhauer as a person at this point. He certainly wasn't out to get Schopenhauer. But at least anecdotally, this seemed to have caused this intense hatred for Hegel on the part of Schopenhauer. So Schopenhauer seemingly thought Hegel was some kind of moron, and this may have been caused by the question that Hegel posed to Schopenhauer. I don't know whether Schopenhauer just took it in the wrong way or whether this was some sort of pre-existing rivalry. But Schopenhauer then proceeded to do a whole bunch of very, very petty things that very nearly got him in quite a lot of trouble. Schopenhauer scheduled his lectures at the same time as Hegel's when he was teaching at the same university. And Hegel was just such a bigger name in philosophy, so lots of people attended Hegel's lectures and very few people attended Schopenhauer's. And this just seemed to further fuel Schopenhauer's victim complex that Hegel and Hegelian philosophy was out to get him, which almost certainly wasn't true. It's just that Hegel was Hegel. He was the biggest name in German philosophy at the time, I think, at least. And Schopenhauer was certainly a much, much smaller name, and so he simply couldn't have expected people to go to his lectures over Hegel's. Also, I remember reading somewhere that the faculty actually wanted to discipline Schopenhauer for this decision to schedule his lectures at the same time as Hegel's, as they saw it as very disrespectful. And I suppose they're right. I mean, this was seemingly a provocation from Schopenhauer to Hegel that he was never going to win. I just really like this one-sided rivalry in the history of philosophy, whereby Schopenhauer seemingly hated Hegel, thought he was a moron, and may have thought that Hegel was out to get him. And Hegel barely really registered Schopenhauer's existence, and when he did, seemed to behave perfectly reasonably. I suppose this does really play into the stereotypes about Schopenhauer's personality, which is that he was intensely disagreeable. I mean, if you read his works, it's not like he comes across as particularly personable, so I am gently inclined to believe it. But it's also worth noting that Schopenhauer's philosophy was really overlooked over the course of his life. It wasn't until very, very late in life, I think, when people really started to pay attention to his works and The World as Will and Representation, his magnum opus, started to be widely appreciated amongst the academic sphere of philosophical Germany at that time. And it's worth remembering that was decades after Schopenhauer first wrote and published it. So he had a long time to nurse this sense that he was an underappreciated genius. And I suppose he was an underappreciated genius, and then he was an appropriately appreciated genius, and then he died. So, all's well that ends well. Next we have a meme by the Flaming Lemon, and it's a road sign, and straight ahead is paying for their own child's chemotherapy, and to the right is buying 4,075 mosquito nets for strangers, and the utilitarians are just swerving and drifting to the right. So this meme, I think, has a number of different layers to it. The mosquito nets are probably in reference to the modern utilitarian idea that the most cost-effective way to save lives is by fighting malaria, and one of the most cost-effective ways to fight malaria is to buy lots of mosquito nets. I don't know if Peter Singer originated this idea or if he just popularized it. I think that the charity GiveWell is a huge fan of mosquito nets and malaria action as a way of saving lives for as little money as possible. I think they ended up placing the cost of saving one life from malaria at around $3,000, although I don't know how they worked that one out. And a lot of people have criticized this attitude to charitable donations and to ethical actions more generally. It's part of the overarching critique of utilitarianism that it boils down a very complex ethical and psychological decision-making process into simply maximizing utility. And I think this criticism is fair enough. It does seem like our ethical intuitions are more complicated than that. A really good example of this is actually the trolley problem. While in popular discourse today, the trolley problem is often used just to ask someone whether they're a utilitarian, it was originally meant to contrast a series of different scenarios to bring out the non-consequentialist aspects of ethical decision-making. So the contrast between pulling a lever, say, and shoving someone off a bridge in order to stop the trolley killing 5 people is meant to tell you something about your ethical intuitions. It's used by some to suggest that there's a difference between killing someone in an impersonal way, like pulling a lever, and using your own 2 hands to commit an offense. In this case, the extreme utilitarian is being criticized for not taking their special duties towards their own children into account. The poster is suggesting that not all pleasure is relevantly ethically equal for every individual decision maker. Not because some people are more valuable than others, but that we bear special duties and special responsibilities towards certain people, say people in our care, or our own children, or our family, or our friends. You can cut this in a variety of different ways. In turn, a lot of utilitarians will respond by saying something like, these special duties or special responsibilities are not grounded in a properly pure moral intuition, but are instead reflections of evolved biases or otherwise extraneous emotional concerns. And I think this actually gets at an interesting tension within ethical study. The thing about ethics is that intuitions are both the source material from which ethicists tend to derive ethical principles, and they are also the means by which they test, refine, and criticize the principles that they've come to. So a lot of ethical debates just are conflicts of moral intuitions, and ethicists are trying to find reasonable ways of resolving them. But especially in recent years, well, by recent years, I mean the last 2 centuries, a lot of ethicists have been able to respond to certain criticisms by saying those are intuitions, but they're not morally relevant intuitions. These are evolutionary intuitions as opposed to ones that reflect real moral truths about the world. But then this raises a further epistemological problem. How do we tell whether a given intuition is a reliable ethical one or an unreliable non-ethical one? Especially given the idea that we are evolved beings whose psychology is contingent on our cultural makeup and also various different genetic factors. There have been various attempts to solve this. Arguably, it was one of Kant's primary concerns, for instance. Not the evolutionary part, obviously, but this idea of how do we infer ethical conduct from a set of unquestionable principles. But I would suggest that this remains an open problem, at least for now. So if you've got any solutions to it, please do leave them in the comments. Okay, next we have a meme by Jealous Jeweler 5598, and it's a photo of Albert Camus. So yeah, Camus the Stranger in a nutshell. I definitely should have put a spoiler warning before this. I'm so sorry. I'll tell you what, I'll say spoilers ahead now, and then hopefully my wonderful video editor will drag and drop this bit of video to before I started talking about the stranger. But anyway, moving on. And it's a photo of Albert Camus, and it reads, "Me after shooting a guy because the sun was on my face." So to those of you who haven't read it, this is a reference to the plot of The Stranger, where Meursault shoots a man dead on a beach, and when he's asked why, he just kind of says it's too hot and the sun was in my eyes. And this is really interesting. It's something that people who've read The Stranger tend to debate quite a lot about. And it certainly gets a lot of mention in scholarship. Some people take it to mean that Meursault is now prioritizing physical factors for his actions over psychological ones or ones to do with meaning and value, given his own absurdist premises. Other people think that it reflects Meursault's dogged commitment to honesty. He can't think of why he shot this man because he honestly doesn't know. And then the only way he can explain his actions is by appealing to the immediate physical stimulus, which is the heat and the sun in his eyes. There is also textual evidence to support Meursault's claim here. In the lead up to him shooting this man, the sun reflects off of the man's knife and into Meursault's eyes, which arguably means that he now no longer knows whether the man is about to attack him, and this is the impetus for him killing the man. So from this perspective, Meursault was acting in what we might call mistaken self-defense. He truly believes, rightly or wrongly, that this man is going to be a threat to him, and that is the impetus for him shooting him. So when he is asked by the courts why he shot the man, he gives them a direct and truthful answer, but it is one that comes across as nonsensical to them because they are searching for the inner workings of Meursault's psychology. This is all if I remember the book correctly. I might have misremembered the exact moment where he shoots the man. But as far as I can recall, that is the lead up to him saying that the reason why he shot this man was because the sun was in his eyes. It is a very difficult line to get your head around as a reader because you think, well, surely Meursault knows that there is more to the story than this. But this also touches upon Meursault's general inability or unwillingness to read between the lines of other people's speech, or otherwise comply with the social implications of other people's statements and actions. When he's asked why did he shoot the man, the short and most honest answer is to do with the sun. It's not to do with his inner psychology, because his inner psychology would have only come into play if the sun were in his eyes. If the sun weren't in his eyes, he wouldn't have shot the man. Ergo, the sun being in his eyes is the best way to explain him shooting the man. Of course, the court simply isn't interested in this kind of explanation, and as a result, they condemn him to death. Okay, next we have a meme by VarDom07, and it says, Stoics after being hit by a missile, and it's someone else asking, how are you not harmed? And the Stoic, as Sonic the Hedgehog, saying, I refuse to be harmed. I quite like this one. It's a sort of parody of the Stoic idea that all harm, or at least most harm, is optional. That is, that you can in some way alleviate harm by changing your relationship to it, and some Stoics have claimed that you can totally alleviate your harm by changing your relationship to it. And I think that this is probably parodying the latter assertion. There are some stories which suggest that some Stoics had this almost superhuman ability to withstand pain and suffering. So, for instance, the legend goes that Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who had much of his life as a slave, according to legend, one day his rather sadistic master was twisting his leg, and Epictetus said, my leg's gonna break if you keep twisting it. And the master continued and continued, and Epictetus kept saying, you're gonna break my leg. And then the master broke his leg, and rather than crying out in pain, Epictetus just went, I told you that would happen. The trouble with quite a lot of anecdotes and legends like this is that it's difficult to tell whether they actually happened or whether this is a later addition to embellish the life and story of what would then become quite legendary philosophers. So while it certainly is true that Stoicism has allowed people throughout history to withstand some pretty awful things, in the Consolations of Philosophy by Boethius, he uses some pretty pseudo-Stoic reasoning, or pseudo makes it sound like it's bad. He uses some semi-Stoic reasoning to convince himself, rightly or wrongly, that his death is not a bad thing. It allows him to cope and consoles him in his time of need. And there are many anecdotal reports of Stoicism allowing people to bear pretty unimaginable hardship, and even just the general whims of fate that life subjects you to. There are going to be times where you suffer and it's not explicable by anything and it doesn't seem fair and it just sucks. And a lot of people find Stoicism very helpful in this situation because it gives them back some control. It tells them that they do have some say over whether this situation is going to hurt them. And to that extent, I do think that Stoicism is right. Although I do think this idea can be taken to really unhelpful extremes. It can sometimes begin to resemble a sort of toxic positivity where, rather than affect any sort of change over a situation, somebody is encouraged to merely accept everything that happens to them. And I think that this can be unhelpful. I think there are times where it makes total sense, right? If you genuinely can't change something about your situation, I don't think that it makes sense to sit there and stew in hatred and anger about it. But there's a big difference between that sort of thing and saying, if you're suffering, it is entirely your fault that you haven't learned to accept this. I don't think that we should reasonably expect people to be able to bear having their leg broken without crying out, like Epictetus supposedly did. I also think this can become unhelpful when, instead of applying it to yourself, you sort of impose it on other people. So rather than saying, I have the mental and spiritual, if you like, reserves to deal with the suffering that comes my way, you instead just tell other people that whatever they're going through, they should just toughen up and learn to deal with it. I think that that is a way of making Stoicism sort of just an excuse to be an asshole. And I also don't think that it's something that Stoic philosophers would encourage. In everything from Epictetus to Marcus Aurelius, and certainly in Seneca, you see this compassionate face of Stoicism. You see them encouraging patience and compassion to other people, and quite a lot of the time encouraging just straightforward kindness. And I think that in modern Stoicism, or I suppose it's sometimes called Broicism, I've heard that label used, which I think is quite fun, much more emphasis is instead placed on the toughness aspects of Stoicism rather than the cultivating virtue aspects of Stoicism. And I think this can lead to this situation where somebody is expecting everyone and themselves to withstand all of the sufferings of the world with an implacable disposition, which I think is going to broadly be unrealistic. And if you want a genuine Stoic philosopher to back up this point, Marcus Aurelius says something very similar in the Meditations, where he reminds himself that nobody else has chosen this path of Stoicism apart from him, and he shouldn't expect Stoic behavior from others. It's all very well him telling himself that he needs to deal with all of the sufferings of the world calmly, but he can't impose this on other people because they haven't chosen it. So there you go. That would be my general commentary on this idea of just flat out refusing to be harmed. I think that it's okay in small doses and in certain situations in your own life. I think it can become unhelpful when it's applied totally with no nuance to every aspect of one's life. And I think it can become even less helpful when it is imposed on others from without. If you want a slightly gentler version of the same idea, you could look at the Buddhist parable of the two arrows. This compares an initial misfortune to being hit with an arrow. And it compares having an unhelpful reaction to that misfortune as being hit by a second arrow. And it says that while the first arrow is inevitable, the second arrow is optional. I think in some ways this is slightly more modest than the caricatured Stoic claim that you can withstand all suffering. For a start, I just don't think that many of the Stoics did claim this, but it is the popular picture that has filtered down into the modern zeitgeist. This Buddhist variant does recognize that some suffering is definitely inevitable, but that we can lessen that suffering in some way by controlling our reactions, or at the very least, we can cease to add to it. Sorry, that one got quite long-winded, so I'll move on. Our next meme is from Wallaby Forward 2, and it's a woman screaming, "Why can't you just be normal?" and Socrates screaming back, "Define normal." I don't have too much to say about this meme other than that it's very accurate. If you've read a lot of Plato's dialogues, quite a lot of them are Socrates asking people to refine definitions, or asking about definitions, or giving definitions. The man is obsessed with definitions, but I would argue he is obsessed with definitions for pretty good reason. If two people have two conflicting definitions, it's very easy for them to just talk past one another. I mean, you see this in politics all of the time. One person will have a particular idea of what a policy or a party or an ideology means, and another person will have a totally different one. And as a result, it's not even that they are unwilling to talk to one another. It is that no conversation can even take place in principle because they are talking about completely different things. It leads to a situation where two people can think they're having the same conversation, when in fact, it's more like they're having two different conversations that happen to be taking place at the same time. And in reality, no ideas are being shared and no discourse is being furthered. And so I do think that a kind of Socratic preoccupation with definitions can help to alleviate some of this. On the other hand, if any of you spend any time trawling through academic philosophy journals, you'll know that the other extreme can get just as bad. Quite a lot of philosophy papers, especially analytic philosophy papers, will be taken up, maybe up to 50% by definitions. 30% is probably about the average from my experience, but it can get really quite ridiculous. Sometimes you read a paper and it will spend about 70% of its length just defining a few key terms and outlining different positions of the literature on these terms and then giving their final definition. And then finally, in the last 30%, they will cram in a very interesting argument that nobody will read because the previous 70% has put them to sleep. So I do think that a sensible middle ground could be found here. But I do think that in public discourse, at least, we might benefit from a slightly more obsessive attitude towards having precise definitions in our speech. Not that I'm always particularly good at this. I think I'm just as guilty as leaving terms undefined as everyone else. I have been thinking more recently about different ways to approach public debate and public discussion, though. The most recent idea I had, which, let me know if this is total rubbish, because I suspect it probably is, would be for some kind of podcast or debating event where everyone turns up and deliberately has to argue the opposing side as best as they can. So, for example, you might have a theist and the atheist has to give their best argument that God exists, and the theist has to give their best argument that God doesn't exist, and then they can hash it out while each arguing for the side that they personally disagree with. But any prizes or accolades are awarded to those who've argued the best. So in effect, you incentivize somebody to temporarily bolster the position of somebody that they would normally be in conflict with. And I think this could just be a fun little experiment. I don't think that anything will necessarily come of it, but I have been talking to a few people about maybe if they'd like to get involved in something like this. Maybe I'll just do 1 hour-long episode if I can get a couple of people involved. And then if you guys really like it, then I'll see if I can do a few more. But no promises. This is all very early in the pipeline. Our next meme is from Throwaway8615907. And it's captioned, "This solves everything." And it's Walter White lying on the ground. And it says, 2,500 years of ethical philosophers when a theist says God is the good and the good is God. I can really empathize with the frustration emanating from this meme. I think that because religion and ethics are so closely intertwined in the public sphere as subjects of debate, there is this implicit assumption in a lot of philosophical discussions that God is the only thing that could ground an objective or absolute moral system. And in academic philosophy, this just isn't considered the case. There are all kinds of different moral realist philosophers, some of whom are theistic, some of whom are atheistic, and some of whom are agnostic. For example, there are a whole host of Kantian thinkers, and I will pop up the name of the person that I'm thinking of on the screen because I can't remember, but she's an absolute genius, who attempt to ground objective morals in our shared recognition of the humanity and agency of other people in a very familiar Kantian move. There are also people who argue for the veracity of our moral intuitions without invoking a god. There are people who argue that God doesn't get you any closer to objective morality because at the end of the day, you are still postulating exactly the same kind of first principle that any kind of moral realist has to postulate, which is that there is something that is equivalent to or just is good. This particular point that God is the good and the good is God probably has its strongest form in scholastic philosophy and in the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas. When St. Thomas Aquinas was sitting down and tackling the Euthyphro dilemma, he accused it of being a false dilemma. And just to give a very brief recap, the Euthyphro dilemma is from one of Plato's earlier dialogues, and it asks, if God is good, is that because God's will defines goodness, or the God's wills define goodness, because Plato's arguing in a polytheistic context? Or is it that the will of the gods is good in virtue of something else? So the gods might know something about goodness that we don't because of our limited human positions or something like that. Or they might be good in virtue of their kindness or their generosity or some other quality that is not simply being them. And Plato claims that either one of these options will raise problems for divine command theory or theist moral philosophy. If God's will is the thing that defines goodness, then the theist has to concede that if God's will changed to recommend something that we would normally consider abhorrent, like, the murder of puppies or something like that, then the theist would have to concede that this does just then become good. On the other hand, if God's will doesn't define goodness and it's simply good in virtue of some other quality, then the theist is saying that that other quality defines goodness, and the atheist can have that as well. So again, they're no better off than the atheist. The Thomist solution to this is pretty elegant. It says that God's will doesn't define goodness, but God's nature defines goodness, and his will is in accordance with that nature. And importantly, God's nature is immutable. It can't change. So you don't have the problem of, what if God asked you to murder a puppy? Because God would never do that. And it's not just that he would never do that, he would necessarily never do that. So you don't have the same kind of variability that gives rise to the Euthyphro dilemma. However, this doesn't completely solve theistic moral philosophy, because ultimately somebody can still ask, well, why is God good? And then the theist has a few options. They can either say there is nothing in virtue of which God is good, in which case they are stipulating a first moral principle, and the atheist can do that as well. Or they're saying that God's nature is good in virtue of something else, in which case, again, the other horn of the Euthyphro dilemma arises. So I don't think that it entirely gets rid of the Euthyphro dilemma, but I do think that it defangs it somewhat. I can imagine a theist just saying, yes, I am positing it as a first principle, and you'll just have to deal with that, which is ultimately what pretty much every moral realist philosopher has to do at some point. So yes, this does take the sting out of the dilemma, but on the other hand, it does also commit the theist to an argumentative move that the atheist can also commit. So ostensibly, the theist can't say that the atheist then cannot have moral realism without God. Anyway, that's such a quick overview of quite a lot of different ideas. But the main takeaway ought to be that the majority of modern ethical philosophers would heavily dispute the idea that you cannot have goodness without God, or that God is the good and the good is God, is a tautology that is just unquestionable. I'm so sorry, I was just about to hit upload on this video and I realised that I completely forgot to record an outro. So thank you so much for watching. If you want to watch any more of these casual meme videos, then you can check them out here and have an absolutely wonderful day. Also, let me know what other more casual video topics you'd like me to cover in the comments below.